Welcome to Human Trafficking 101 and Trafficking Truths, put on by Villanova University's Charles Widger School of Law, Institute to Address Commercial Sexual Exploitation, and presented by the director and co-founder, Shea Rhodes. My name is Kim Moore, and I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Relations for the law school. And before we get started, I just have a few quick announcements to share. As a reminder, this program is part of a three-part series. If you haven't already, we encourage you to sign up for the next two programs, which are happening on January 20th and January 27th. We'll include a link to register for these programs in the post-event email that's going to be sent out today. If you have any questions during the program, either for Shea or if you're having any technical problems, please use the Q&A function. We'll work on responding to all content-related questions during the program or during the Q&A at the end. We have tech on standby for any issues that you might have during the program. If you're taking today's program for CLE credit, please take note of this slide. Throughout the program, we will announce 3 CLE words, and it is your responsibility to write them down so that you can submit them in your CLE evaluation. That evaluation will be sent around 12:45 today, and Villanova is unable to share the words with you if you miss them. So we encourage you to write them down. If you have any questions about that, please contact our alumni office at alumni@law.villanova.edu. All right, and now it is my pleasure to introduce the CSE Institute's director and presenter today, Shea Rhodes. Shea has dedicated her career to combating violence against women, protecting the rights of those who are oppressed or exploited, and championing human rights. She is the statewide legal expert on Pennsylvania laws related to sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. As the co-founder and director of the Institute at Villanova, Ms. Rhodes works with and on behalf of victims and survivors on commercial sexual exploitation and human trafficking. Welcome, Shea.
Kim, thank you so much. I'm so grateful to all of you for joining today. It is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and we are so excited to have all of you here. And I just wanted to give a couple of thank yous before we begin the substance of this CLE. As you all know, this is a fundraiser for our Justice for Victims Clinical Fellowship. We provide direct legal services to survivors of sex trafficking, and we could not do this without your generous support. I do want to give a really just heartfelt thank you to Julie Eubler and Stephen Wall for their enormous and generous gift of $200,000. It's going to be your donations today will be matched dollar for dollar up to that $200,000, so we can keep our fellows employed and keep working so hard on behalf of survivors. I also want to give a heartfelt thank you to Cozen O'Connor to supporting today's event and for our Justice for Victims Fellowship. Also give just a little shout out to one of our alums who works at Cozen, Marie Bussy Garza, who's just been so gracious in advocating for us at Cozen. And I also could not have do any of this work without Carol Landis and her Foundation for Social Change. Carol took a chance on us about 6 years ago and helped us with the original seed money to start our Justice for Victims Fellowship, and continues to support the work that we do. So thank you to Carol. And with that, I think I am ready to start our CLE. Let's see if I can do this. Tech is not my thing, you guys, but I will do my best. All right. We good to go here? Also, I just want to give another really quick reminder to everyone that I have my team on this CLE series, and Alexia and Mary will answer any of the questions that you have in real time if you put them into the Q&A. Alexia is our Senior Justice for Victims Fellow right now. Hi, Lex. Thank you so much. And she'll take care of any questions that you have, or she'll stop me and interrupt me if I don't see a hand raised or something like that. So at the end of today's presentation, I'm really hopeful that you'll understand and appreciate the reality of sex trafficking in the US and here in Pennsylvania, understand both federal and Pennsylvania sex trafficking laws, that you'll be familiar with the signs of sex trafficking victimization, and that you'll understand the trafficking conspiracy theories versus the reality of what trafficking is and why it's so important that we pay attention, especially as lawyers, to the rhetoric and statistics that we use when we're talking about sex trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation. Just a quick background on who we are here at the CSE Institute. We have a mission to educate and provide technical assistance to those who respond to commercial sexual exploitation in Pennsylvania, the US, and beyond. We promote victim-centered, trauma-informed, multidisciplinary collaboration. We equip policymakers and the broader community with the skills and knowledge necessary to improve Pennsylvania and national legal systems' response to commercial sexual exploitation, to support survivors, hold perpetrators accountable. We center the experiences of survivors and their lived experiences in every single thing that we do in order to inform the development of our policies and best practices to combat CSE. And we're committed to engaging the survivor community and shaping any of our positions. We don't put anything out there without first touching base with our survivor leaders and our partners and paying attention to exactly what they say. And finally, we aim to create a community in which every human being is treated with dignity, compassion, and respect, inspired by Villanova University's Charles Woodger School of Law's Catholic and Augustinian mission. So I just want to ask you guys, how much do you know about human trafficking? Let's just go through a couple myths and facts here. True or false? In order for the crime of human trafficking to take place, there must be some type of movement of the victim. What do you guys think? True or false? It's false. Human trafficking is not human smuggling. Although transportation could be an element of the crime, it is not essential to prove the crime. True or false? Human trafficking takes place only in urban communities. I can't tell you how many times that, because of my background as a former Philadelphia prosecutor, being told by people who live in other sections of our Commonwealth that, oh, this only happens in Philly. Actually, that's not true. Human trafficking occurs in rural, suburban, and urban communities, and it appears differently given the community that you live in, but it's absolutely happening, and I can tell you, in almost all 67 counties here in our Commonwealth. True or false? Human traffickers rarely know the persons that they victimize. And I can tell you that at the end of this is one of the biggest myths that was being promoted in July on social media. It's absolutely false. Perpetrators can be anyone, a family member, an intimate partner, an acquaintance, or a stranger. And I can tell you that the majority of sex trafficking victims absolutely know their trafficker. I think I just answered this one. Oh, here we go. And finally, true or false? A victim can be trafficked one time in order to meet the federal and state definition of what constitutes trafficking. It's true. There's no time requirement for trafficking. Once the elements of the crime have been satisfied, trafficking has taken place. It can mean a single time or over the course of decades. Is it easy to identify a victim of human trafficking? True or false? False, and I have to say that this is probably law enforcement and prosecutors' biggest obstacle, is that many victims do not self-identify, and that there is oftentimes an overlap with other co-occurring crimes. Somebody's calling me. So what is human trafficking? It is a crime of violence under both state and federal law, and it is the illegal trade of human beings for the purposes of commercial sexual exploitation or forced labor. It is a lucrative industry, and it's an exploitive industry driven by demand. So here we go with federal sex trafficking laws. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act was first passed in the year 2000. It was the first law in America that addressed the trafficking of people for both labor and for sex. Although it was enacted initially in the year 2000, it has been reauthorized several times, beginning in 2003, with the latest reauthorization happening in 2019. The TVPA, or the TVPRA, gives us two key definitions: involuntary servitude and a commercial sex act. And I want to focus today, since we're talking about sex trafficking specifically, on the commercial sex act, which is any sex act on account of which anything of value is given to or received by any person. Think about that for a moment. It's any sex act on account of which anything of value is given to or received by any person. Anything of value is what's key there. So ask yourselves, what constitutes anything of value? And I'll explain a little bit more in a moment. In 2015, President Obama signed the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act. It created a fund to support the services for domestic trafficking victims. It mandated additional training requirements for first responders. It updated the definition of forms of child abuse to include human trafficking and child pornography, calling upon the states to change their reporting requirements of child abuse to include human trafficking, commercial sexual exploitation of a child as being on the list of things that constitute child abuse, that if a mandated reporter comes in contact with a sexually exploited child, they must report that as child abuse. And finally, the JVTA added 3 acts to the list of criminal conduct: advertises, patronizes, and solicits. And I'm going to explain why that's so important in just a few moments. So the federal crime is codified in the United States Crimes Code at section 1591A. It is sex trafficking of children or by force, fraud, and coercion. And you can see here that it's a lengthy statute. Most of you on this webinar today are lawyers. You know how to read statutes, but I think it's a little bit complicated. And so we have an easy way of teaching it by breaking it down and showing you that the crime, because again, human trafficking is a crime of violence, can be broken down into 3 key elements: an act, by a means, for a purpose. And this is where I want to talk about that commercial sex act being the purpose. We're talking about sex trafficking, so we need that commercial sex act to be the purpose of the crime. And I again told you, anything of value in exchange for a sex act. So yes, money, right? Money can absolutely be that thing of value, but it's also food, clothing, shelter, safety. It could be material things like an iPhone or an iPad. It could be getting your hair and your nails done. It could be a hotel room in case you're homeless. Anything of value in exchange for a sex act. That's really important. So first, you need an act, and there is a list of acts to pick from. You can have more than one act, but you only need one if you're a prosecutor and you're in, court in front of a jury. You need to prove one of these beyond a reasonable doubt. So we have recruits, entices, harbors, transports, provides, obtains, advertises, maintains, patronizes, or solicits. So you only need one of those acts. Or you could be what we call third-party facilitators, knowingly financially benefiting or receiving something of value from helping a trafficker out with those acts. I'm going to explain a little bit more in a moment. The means: you need to have force, fraud, or coercion. You can have force and coercion, force by itself, fraud and coercion, fraud by itself, coercion with any of them, but you only need one: force, fraud, or coercion. Now I'm going to take that back. If you're the victim in the trafficking case is a child, anybody under the age of 18, force, fraud, and coercion do not have to be proven in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt. That doesn't mean that traffickers aren't using force, fraud, and coercion if their victim is a child. It just means that for the purposes of prosecution, the government doesn't have to prove it as an element of the crime. So let's get into talking about what these acts mean and what they look like in real life. But first, your first code word: patronizes. Remember that, write that down, screenshot it. Patronizes is your first code word. So these acts, what do they mean? And I can tell you that here in Pennsylvania, we don't have any case law yet on our books here in Pennsylvania that is describing or explaining what our legislature meant by our acts. So we have to look to federal law as non-binding precedent. And federal law has defined recruits in case law as social media. We know, especially now during this pandemic, that social media is a really big recruiting tool. And I can tell you that in a recent case that happened over the summer, where individuals were arrested in Malvern, Pennsylvania, not far from the law school here, social media was what was used to recruit the victims in that case, specifically Snapchat. We also know that traffickers recruit directly from people who are serving time in prison or jail and in courtrooms. And if you're interested in learning more about that and the intersection with the incarcerated population and how they are vulnerable to be trafficked, I really highly recommend a documentary. It's only about 32 minutes long that you can just Google. It's called The Trap, and The Guardian put that out a couple of years ago. It's really informative. There's also the role of the bottom girl, and that comes into play with this victim offender intersectionality, which we've written about quite a bit. And if you're interested in that, Alexia or Mary will put in the chat the link to a recent paper that we published about a year ago, along with Shared Hope International, discussing the victim offender intersectionality and why it's so important for people who are helping survivors to be mindful of this intersectionality. But it's when a trafficker has someone who they're also trafficking, who is also forced to recruit or bring others in for the trafficker to traffic. We know that this United States versus Mosey case out of the 11th Circuit, recruits also shows that the victims don't actually have to engage in the commercial sex acts, just that they were recruited for it, and that the court found the defendant guilty in that case. He was recruiting victims using business cards and providing applications. So that is the act of recruits. The next act is entices. And I refer to this one as when the trafficker is selling the dream, right? Making false pretenses to attract artfully or adroitly by arousing hope or desire. It's the Romeo pimp. It's, I love you, I'm going to take care of you, we're going to get that house with the white picket fence, or I'm going to buy you all the things that you want, but you have to do this. And they force their victims to prostitute. The next act is harbors, and this is where we have this dual liability of the hospitality industry. And for those of you that are interested and who might be doing personal injury type of work or civil litigation, we know that, and we're watching nationally sort of this new impact litigation that's unfolding throughout the US against the hotel industry, where the hotels are being sued civilly for their role in helping traffickers traffic in their hotel rooms. We know that Klein Inspector, I believe, has 4 cases in litigation right now. We know that the Marriott and the American Hotel and Lodging Association have been sued, but we also know that the hotel industry can be our ally in this fight, and that they are training their employees to recognize the signs of trafficking, because again, they don't want their bottom line impacted by allowing criminal activity to happen on their premises. We know that co-occurring crimes like kidnapping or torts like false imprisonment go along with this crime of harboring. And I can tell you that one of our alumni here from the law school, Sean Camoni, is an assistant United States attorney in the Middle District in Pennsylvania. And he just had a phenomenal cutting edge criminal verdict in a federal prosecution where he indicted and tried the corporate entity in addition to the managers of a hotel chain up in the Poconos area. And he got a guilty verdict on that, which is really huge. It's the first time the corporate entity has ever been indicted, the corporate entity of a hotel has ever been indicted in a trafficking case. So good job to Sean. We know that in the Eighth Circuit in the US versus Paul case, the defendant harbored the victim in hotel rooms in between commercial sex transactions. So, and we know that it's happening in our area. And I can tell you that I've heard and spoken with survivors and victims, as well as prosecutors at the state and federal level. We know that this is happening in hotels out here on the main line where Villanova sits, in Philadelphia, up in Northeast Philadelphia, in Center City, Philadelphia, which is where I happen to live. And it doesn't have to be in just those no-tell, motel type of situations. It's in all hotels that it's happening. So we need to be mindful and vigilant. The act of transports. We've got two cases at the federal level, one out of the Ninth Circuit and one out of the Sixth Circuit. The Ninth Circuit held that driving a victim to the bus station and purchasing bus tickets was enough to prove the element of transports. We also know that forced relocation from one place to another constitutes transports. Provides. What does provides mean? Make adequate preparation for a possible event. We know that there is such a huge intersection between the opioid crisis and trafficking, and providing someone with the controlled substances they need to self-medicate and disassociate to be sold repeatedly over and over for sex acts is something that traffickers really do capitalize on, that opioid crisis. Provides also means making available for use and supply, so it could be arranging and managing those commercial sex transactions. What does maintains means? Provide with necessities. So if a trafficker buys someone a hamburger once a week, again, that providing shelter, right? Keeping them in a hotel room, keeping their clothing. It means causing or enabling a condition to continue. Isolation is a big part of maintaining, not letting their victims have any contact with their families or making it untenable for them to have contact with friends and family. And we also know this is where the psychological torture comes in and that coercive factor. Why trauma is something that we all work so hard on helping survivors along their path of healing. So patronizes and advertises. You remember back on that slide, I told you about the JVTA passing and being signed into law by President Obama in 2015. They added in both of these elements, patronizes and advertises. I'm going to talk, and also solicits. So I'm going to talk about advertises first. Advertises is something that we all know is happening, and the most notorious online advertisements were happening on Craigslist and then ultimately on Backpage.com. I could sit here and speak with you guys about the Communications Decency Act and the amendments that we advocated are, and this is really front and center right now, you know, just sort of like in our media all the time about who is Twitter and Facebook allowing and what you can say on these platforms. But we know that Backpage.com was taken down after a lengthy investigation by the Department of Justice, and they indicted Backpage's owners and conspirators. But this is where people were being advertised for sex. We know that this, in the United States versus Lacey case, which is part of this Backpage.com criminal litigation, the victim was posted for online advertisements that were paid for by her trafficker. We know that there are still ongoing criminal case and they've been delayed due to the pandemic, but there are also a lot of civil suits pending against Backpage.com nationally. But just because Backpage.com was seized by the federal government doesn't mean it's not still happening online. We know locally in this area, Skip the Games, Best Girlfriend Experience, these particular websites are used by traffickers to sell their victims to sex buyers online. So patronizes is really important, and it goes along here with this slide, solicits. And just be really clear with you all that we also have a crime in our crimes code here in Pennsylvania called patronizing a victim of sexual servitude as part of our trafficking law. And we also have a crime in our crimes code called patronizing prostitution. Those crimes absolutely apply to someone who is purchasing sex, the demand for commercial sex. We refer to them here at the CSC Institute as the sex buyer. So why was it so important for Congress to amend the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and specifically the crime in the Federal Crimes Code, Section 1591, to add patronizes and solicits? It's because Congress wanted to ensure that law enforcement and our prosecutors unequivocally recognized that traffickers are making money because someone is buying their commodity, a human being, and putting money in the trafficker's pockets, that sex buyer. And it's because of this federal case out of the Eighth Circuit, the Youngers case, where the court held that the term obtains is broad enough to apply to both traffickers and buyers, sex buyers. So obtains is one of those acts. And so this Youngers case was ultimately appealed to the Eighth Circuit. The government, the federal government, prosecuted this individual, this sex buyer named Youngers, using Section 1591. They moved on the act of obtains and accused Youngers of buying sex from a child. So we didn't need to prove force, fraud, and coercion. The government didn't need to prove force, fraud, and coercion in their case in chief for the purposes of a commercial sex act. And Youngers appealed the verdict, the guilty verdict, saying, hey, Congress did not mean for obtains to apply to sex buyers. Congress only meant for this law to apply to traffickers. The pimp controlled prostitution trafficker, right? The brothel and prostitution trafficker. And the court, in our opinion, said you're wrong. Obtains is absolutely broad enough to apply to sex buyers. And they gave a hypothetical, which I'm going to paraphrase here, in the opinion. And they said, what if a sex buyer wanted to take a teenager, to Las Vegas for the weekend? So he gives the pimp $1,000 and takes that 15 or 16-year-old child in a car to the airport, gets on a plane, flies to Vegas, stays in a hotel, might have dinner, decides that $1,000 wasn't enough, and wants to bargain with the child to have more sex and says, I'll give you $100 for every additional sex act. And this child victim is like, okay, whatever. And they have their Vegas weekend, and they fly back to Vegas, and he turns the child back over to the trafficker. So just backing up briefly to this slide, I can tell you that that sex buyer in that hypothetical recruited, enticed, harbored, transported, provided, obtained, we didn't have advertises or patronizes or solicits back then, and maintained that child. So all of those acts that existed at the time of that case, that sex buyer absolutely engaged in with that child. And Congress went back and added in patronizes and solicits to make sure that sex buyers are held accountable for their role in trafficking as traffickers. Do I want all of you to think that every sex buyer is a trafficker? Absolutely not. That would be irresponsible of me. And I think that we really need to focus on what demand for commercial sex needs to be investigated and prosecuted as traffickers when appropriate. Obviously, it's the child buyers, those who are purchasing sex from a child. We know that Commonwealth versus SIPS happened right here in Delaware County, where a sex buyer was prosecuted and convicted for buying sex from a child victim of sex trafficking. It's a guilty verdict at the Delaware District Attorney's Office. It was wonderful. We also know that high frequency buyers, those who are driving the commercial sex trade to exist by going on to review boards, which do exist. They're out there. They're like Yelp for sex buyers. And they can rate the commodity that they're purchasing as though the human being is a piece of meat or a hamburger or a nail salon that they're putting a good Yelp rating for. Those high frequency buyers, we at least know in King County, Washington, and where Seattle, Washington is, that the prosecutors out there a couple of years ago shut down a ring called the League that were on some chat rooms. They infiltrated this chat room and this group of men who were buying sex, and they determined during their prosecution that these men were spending between, and it was all men, were spending between $30,000 and $50,000 a year on buying sex. So those we consider high frequency buyers. So I've just gone through all of the acts, and what I hope that you have learned is that the criminal law really does target a broad spectrum of conduct, and it indiscriminately applies to the traffickers, sex buyers, and those third-party facilitators alike, like the hotel industry. For transport, a third-party facilitator could be a taxi, a cab driver, a limo driver, something like that. Again, someone who's knowingly benefiting financially or receiving something from that or value from helping a trafficker do what they do. So let's move on to the means element. Force, fraud, and coercion. Again, force, fraud, and coercion don't have to be proven in a court of law if the victim is a child. It does have to be proven in a court of law if the victim is an adult, anybody over the age of 18. Force is self-explanatory. And again, when I train prosecutors on this, I ask them, look for medical records, look for scars, look for indications. Somebody went to the ER for broken bones, or there's scars from cigarette burns. Fraud. This Bell case out of the Eighth Circuit also tells us what fraud is. And coercion, that's the psychological trauma that is just what I believe one of these biggest obstacles that survivors have is to overcome the trauma and begin to heal. But what does fraud mean in the context of pimp-controlled sex trafficking? It's that boyfriend type behavior. It's deception about marital status. This case is really excellent, and it explains a lot more than just this fraud means element. It really gets into the tactics of how traffickers are recruiting victims with a vulnerability, and specifically the victims in this case had mental disabilities. They'd been in and out of the hospital. He deceived them about who he was married to, and now he loved them no matter what. He was going to marry them. They were the only one. There were at least 3 victims in this case. And he created this pattern of convincing these women that he loved them. He was going to take care of them, not take care of anyone else. And he would pit them against one another, and created a real coercive, awful, abusive psychological environment, as well as creating this boyfriend type behavior, which does constitute fraud under federal law. And again, I've spoken to you already about this purpose element, but this is key. It's a commercial sex act. It's any sex act on account of which anything of value is given to or received by any person. That's key. So everybody get your pen out or your screenshot or whatever you need to do. We've got our second code word of the morning. Anything. Anything of value. All right. Write it down, save it. So let's talk now about Pennsylvania's sex trafficking law. Back in 2013, 2014, as I was working with my co-founder of the Institute here, Professor Michelle Dempsey, we had a piece of legislation pending in Pennsylvania's legislature. It was Act 105 of 2014, and we started this institute in the fall of 2014 at the exact same time Pennsylvania's comprehensive human trafficking law went into effect. So we've been watching the implementation and tracking statistics that come directly from prosecutions of this particular law. It's codified in Chapter 30 in our Crimes Code. And when we were advocating it, we were focusing on 3 primary goals: the prosecution, prevention, and protection. Prosecution of traffickers, prevention of trafficking, and protection for victims and survivors. So in the definition section located in 3001, there's a clear definition of not only sex trafficking, but also labor trafficking. So this comprehensive law created really good elements and definitions for prosecutors and investigators here in our Commonwealth to target labor traffickers and sex traffickers. So September 2nd or 3rd, 2014, this law goes into effect. The first jury trial and conviction did not happen in our Commonwealth until February of 2016, February 2016. Deputy District Attorney Rob Schoaf out of Lehigh County is the one who had the first 2 jury trials and successful prosecutions here in our Commonwealth. But that date gap from the date the law goes into effect and the first prosecution should tell you a couple things. Number one, self-identification is something that victims don't do. It's an obstacle to prosecutions. We also know that they have complex trauma, and the victims in that case, unsurprisingly, like most of our clients, have a co-occurring substance use disorder, specifically heroin. These cases take a long time to build. Prosecutors and law enforcement must be victim-centered. We're going to talk more later in the series about what trauma-informed lawyering means and those 5 core values. So stay tuned, and I hope you come back and join us for that. But we know that to date, there have been 47, maybe a little bit more, tracked convictions in the Commonwealth. We've just ordered our data from the Administrative Office of Pennsylvania Courts for the year 2020, since we're just barely into 2021. So the definition of sex trafficking under Pennsylvania law, it's called sexual servitude. It's any sex act or performance involving a sex act for which anything of value is directly or indirectly given, promised to, or received by any individual, or which is performed or provided by any individual and is induced or obtained from a minor, that's a child, or any other individual by the means set forth in section 3012B. So right here, in this definition, we know that Pennsylvania's law is aligned with the federal government's law. The means, force, fraud, and coercion is what the federal law says. And our means are set forth in 3012B, only have to be proven if the victim is an adult. Those means, force, fraud, and coercion, or our means set forth in 3012B, do not come into play in a court of law beyond a reasonable doubt if the victim is a child. So, trafficking in individuals is codified in our crimes code in section 3011, and this is where our acts are. And if you'll notice here, we have recruits, entices, solicits, advertises, harbors, transports, provides, obtains, or maintains. We have all of the same acts that the federal government has, except patronizes. So all the acts that I walked through and what that looks like, same thing here in Pennsylvania. We do not have patronizes. I've been advocating very hard for our legislature to add it in right here to 3011A, but right now it does not exist. We also have the ability to use this statute to go after those third-party facilitators who knowingly benefit financially or receive anything of value from any act facilitated in paragraph 1. Again, those acts are all the same as the federal government. The means, this is where our law breaks it down, and our legislature was incredibly thoughtful when they did this. They didn't just say the means of force, fraud, and coercion. They said, we're going to give you 13 factors. So you can pick 2, you can pick all 13, you only need 1. What we've done to make this easy to train alongside with the federal law, and we train statewide and nationally on this issue, depending on where we go and what is expected from us. But we've broken down our 13 factors in 3012B to put in those 3 categories, or those 3 buckets of force, fraud, and coercion. So these first 3 elements, again, you only need 1, but these first 3, 1, 2, and 3 in 3012B, we can put in this category of force. So it's causing or threatening to cause serious harm to any individual. Physically restraining or threatening to physically restrain another individual, that would go along with co-occurring crimes, right? And number 3, kidnapping or attempting to kidnap any individual. And I always suggest to prosecutors, if you're gonna charge 3012B3, charge kidnapping as well. Charge false imprisonment as well. Fraud is number 8 on that list. And our legislature just set forth fraud. But we do know, if we look at that federal law, that Bell case that came down out of the 8th Circuit as non-binding precedent, that boyfriend type behavior applies. And we see that more often than not, those Romeo pimps. Coercion. Again, this is where the psychological trauma and pain's happening. Abusing or threatening to abuse the legal process. And this is how we see that. If you don't do the commercial sex acts for me, I'm going to take away your kids. I'm going to call Department of Human Services or Children and Youth on you. You'll never see your children again. This is something that when we're training professionals, we always try to ensure that they're mindful, and all of you lawyers out there who want to represent survivors, make sure that you're mindful of not engaging in a parallel process, right? If you're a judge, not violating someone for probation or holding that over their head. A prosecutor saying, I'm going to charge you with prosecution unless you, I'm going to charge you with prostitution unless you cooperate with me in this trafficking case. Now, I talk about prostitution a lot in the work that we do here at the CNC Institute, and I just want to take a moment before I move on to these next means that also make out coercion. I talk about prostitution a lot, and I don't want you all to think that all prostitution is sex trafficking. It's not. It's absolutely not. But a commercial sex act, the purpose of sex trafficking is prostitution. So we cannot talk about sex trafficking without also talking about prostitution, because that's what people see. That's what our law enforcement sees. Number 5, in coercion. Taking or restraining an individual's personal or real property as a means of coercion. I've seen instances where traffickers will have a joint bank account, or they'll have their mom on a joint bank account with their victims, and they'll clean out the bank account. They've given money and they'll take it away, and there's no legal remedy to that. I've also heard instances, one specifically that happened in Philadelphia County, where a trafficker forced a mom of a victim to sign over her home, the deed to her home. Number 6 is engaging in unlawful conduct with respect to documents as defined in section 3014. Just a note here, unlawful conduct with respect to documents doesn't, you immediately think, oh, those are undocumented, so a passport or a visa or something like that. It doesn't just pertain to documents of immigrants or foreign nationals. It's any state identification document. And 9 times out of 10, when a trafficker is trafficking people out of a hotel, they will rent the hotel rooms in their adult victims' names, and they will hold their IDs. So the trafficker will know where they live and possibly know where their family lives. Extortion, which is also defined in our law, but more often than not, we see extortion like this. If you don't engage in these commercial sex acts, being forced to prostitute, right? I'm going to show all those pornographic videos I shot of you to your family. And that's how that happens. Number 9, criminal coercion is defined in 2906. It's already in the Crimes Code. Number 10, duress, through the use of or threat to use unlawful force against the person of another. That's where this coercion can feel like choice comes into play. If a trafficker beats one of his victims in front of the other victims, it's that inherent threat. Well, wow, if she's his favorite and he will beat her, and I see that happening, it could happen to me. It becomes unsaid. It only has to happen once. Debt coercion. This is huge and really important for our prosecutors to understand this, and for our criminal defense attorneys to understand this. And I can't tell you how many times it's been brought to my attention that someone who's facing prostitution charges has had really high cash bail set against them. Who do you think pays the bail? Trafficker. Who do you think hires a private criminal defense attorney? The trafficker. How do you think that victim is going to pay the trafficker back? By being forced to prostitute. So that's how debt coercion happens most often in sex trafficking cases. My favorite one, not because, yay, this is great, but because our legislature was so thoughtful by including this. Facilitating or controlling an individual's access to a controlled substance. The opioid crisis I've mentioned before, and I'll say it again, is something traffickers have capitalized on. And we know that it's not just enough to give them or get them addicted to heroin or pills. Facilitating or controlling their access. We know, and I have met many victims whose traffickers have withheld heroin. And what do we know about heroin? If you don't continue to get it, you will become very sick. And what do we know about the brain science involved with that addiction is that a victim will do anything just to keep from getting dope sick. It's very controlling. And then finally, using any scheme, plan or pattern intended to cause the individual to believe that if they don't perform, in this case, as we're talking about these commercial sex acts, they or someone else is going to suffer harm or physical restraint. So at this point, we are done talking about the means in Pennsylvania law. Hey, Lex, I see that there's a Q&A up there. Just want to make sure that we're answering the questions as they come in. So, sorry. Patronizing a victim of sexual servitude. I'm of the opinion that this is a really unnecessary crime in our crimes code, but this is the way that our legislature has decided to deal with the sex buyers who patronize a victim of sexual servitude, meaning that they're buying sex from a sex trafficking victim. They've made it its own crime. It's codified in section 3013. And if I got my way with all the education and advocacy that we're doing in Harrisburg, we would delete this from the crimes code altogether and not have this extra crime in there, but we would just put patronizes in 3011A. Again, because of that Younger's case I already told you guys about. But we do have this as a standalone own crime. A person commits a felony of the second degree. Again, if it was put over into 3011A, it would be a felony of the first degree, which is more important, or excuse me, more serious. If the person engages in any sex act or performance with another individual knowing, and that's, we had this little amendment come in last session, the legislature added in knowing that, or with reckless disregard for whether that their victim is a victim of trafficking. So knowing it's a first degree felony, reckless disregard is a second degree felony. And this came forward in the Buyer Beware Act, which was a compromise. Again, I've been advocating really hard for them just to add patronizes into the acts and be done with it. It's more efficient, and prosecutors, I believe, job will be easier and absolutely in line with the federal government. So in looking at our map of Pennsylvania, we've got all of the counties here in Pennsylvania, all 67 of them. And if there is any shade of blue in a county, that means that there has been a trafficking prosecution charged. The darker the blue means the more cases. And we know here in southeastern Pennsylvania, there have been more cases than out west. But I can tell you here in Wayne County, which is one of our most rural counties in Pennsylvania, they only have one common pleas court judge, and judges are based on population in each county. It's where one of the first 5 prosecutions and convictions was held in Pennsylvania, and that also happened in 2016, and the victim in that case was a minor. We also know that here in Cambria County, also another really rural county, is one of those first 5 prosecutions and convictions. We know that statewide, we've been able to track, we've got 39 ongoing cases right now. We've got, looks like we have had 48 convictions to date. There have been 59 cases either withdrawn or null prossed. 15 of those 59 cases we know went federal, and there was either some kind of plea agreement made for a lesser included offense, or a victim wasn't cooperative, but we know that 59 of the cases were not ultimately prosecuted in the county. So why is it really important for us to talk about conspiracies in reality? And I can tell you that I'm seeing these questions. I'm going to answer them. Oh, that skipped ahead. Excuse me. Sorry, my tech isn't working. What has been the resistance to adding patronizes? Both of these questions. I can tell you that I've had this conversation a lot in the legislature, that someone who is a sex buyer, they don't, the conversations I've had sort of go like this. What if that sex buyer just got divorced and, you know, he has needs, and he's got alimony, and he has child support, and he was traveling on business, and is he really as culpable of a trafficker? Yes, in my opinion. So we've been taking every opportunity to engage and educate and say that this money, this multi-billion-dollar worldwide industry, that sex trafficking is, labor and sex trafficking, excuse me, is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's worldwide. We know that as far as sex trafficking is concerned, the majority of victims worldwide are women and girls. And I can tell you that in 2019, our latest data shows that everyone arrested and charged for buying sex in Pennsylvania was a man. Everyone, 100%. Why do we want to protect them? Because he's that guy with alimony and child support, but it's his money that contributes to that $1 billion that traffickers are putting in their pockets. And I believe, in one of our values here at the CSE Institute, is that prostitution is gender-based violence. And we need to we need to add it, right, to the conversations that we're having about domestic violence and sexual violence. And it's really, really important to talk about the population of people causing the violence. So we're just taking an opportunity to really move forward and educate people about the fact that without the demand for commercial sex, traffickers wouldn't make any money and no one would be victimized. There is an absolute overlap with domestic violence. We know that traffickers are family members, intimate partners, neighbors, friends, and the power and control wheel for domestic violence. I'm happy to send my PowerPoint to anybody, but we've adapted it for the domestic violence power and control wheel. We've adapted it for trafficking, and I'm happy to share and send this slide with everyone. We know that sex trafficking in Pennsylvania is happening in hotels, that there's prostitution and trafficking rings. It's happening in illicit massage businesses, as well as in child pornography rings. These are the cases that we see. Most routinely, pimp controlled prostitution is the majority of what our clients have experienced, but we have had survivors who were child survivors of family-based sex trafficking, a couple involved in the illicit massage businesses, and definitely in child pornography rings. There's a real intersection, especially now during COVID, with everyone being so isolated, and the pornography and what's happening on the internet has just really exploded when it comes to trafficking. I've really spoken quite a bit about this influence of addiction in the opioid crisis, but they're absolutely interrelated. If I were being trafficked all day, every day, being forced to have sex with strangers day in and day out, I would do whatever it took to dissociate and not be there. It's just medication. It's a way of disassociating and not being present. It's absolutely a means of coercion, and we know that it's a precursor and a consequence of victimization. So these myths and conspiracies, somebody anonymously just asked if the legislature is mostly men a factor in the patronization absence. What do you think? I'm just going to leave it at that. Wait, we have a code word: misinformation. I'm going to put this back. This summer, my phone started blowing up. Text messages, and I'm not really very involved in social media, although we have Facebook page and Instagram page and a Twitter account. And my students and my team really engage, and we're putting out great messaging. So I would really suggest that you follow them. But my students and the younger lawyers who work for me, Jamie Peasy just moved on, were, wow, Shea, social media blowing up, this hashtag save the children, save our children. Something's going crazy. We're seeing all these like statistics and these theories, especially about related to COVID. If your child wears a mask, that child, to protect themselves from getting COVID or others from getting COVID, that child is going to be kidnapped, and we'll never be able to find that child again, or we won't know where that child is, or because of the mask, we won't be able to find them. Or if you're walking through the Walmart parking lot, you're definitely going to get kidnapped. Or if there's like a zip tie on your car. QAnon capitalized and grew on this hashtag save the children with all of this misinformation. And it just got out of control in July, August, September. So we engaged with some survivors nationally to amplify a myth busting campaign that they were working on. So what they did was they were blurring the lines between legitimate anti-trafficking activism and partisan conspiracy mongering. And I want to say combating sex trafficking is a bipartisan issue. No one wants sex trafficking to happen. And this has been really helpful in moving laws to strengthen victims' protection forward and hold offenders accountable. And all of a sudden, this was becoming really polarized, and part of the polarization happening on social media. We were seeing things like Hollywood eats babies. I think that they were saying that Michelle Obama was drinking the blood of children. And some people in the anti-trafficking movement were saying things like, this is great because people are opening their eyes. And we took the completely opposite position. This was actually hurting our movement. Here's our code word: misinformation. It was spreading misinformation and other dangerous narratives. It was delegitimizing real resources. It was diverting. People were capitalizing on fundraising on this. And we were watching these rallies with people holding Save the Children signs. And I was like, where's this money going? And who's raising? What are they doing? And legitimate organizations were starting to really hurt even more financially. We also know that Polaris, which runs the national hotline, had to put out a statement saying, like, we're getting all these calls. There's this extreme volume of calls and contacts, and it was making it really difficult for them to provide support and attention to victims who really needed help. And then it was normalizing this rhetoric that we never use, which is saving and rescuing. Our job here at the CSE Institute is to create laws and policies and provide direct legal services. That means we're solving survivors of sex trafficking legal problems. We're not rescuing them. We're not saving them. Although I would love to say I'm a superhero and that I, am just like Wonder Woman that just came out and I saw it. She's so great, with her golden lasso and her ability to do all of these things. I'm not a superhero and I'm not a trauma surgeon saving lives. Any saving and rescuing happens internally within a survivor. It's their healing. We can provide them support. We can provide them the tools that they need and empower them. But the healing and the rescuing and the saving is something that's very personal. This isn't about me. I'm a lawyer. It's my job to solve legal problems. But this quote, which we took, I think this was in the Insider, really hit home for me. Why these conspiracy theories were so dangerous. Christy Croft is a sex trafficking survivor and she's an activist. And she told the Insider that as a survivor, when I see it, I feel exploited again. I feel like my trauma and the trauma of people like me is being exploited for purposes other than ending trafficking. It's really infuriating when you have survivors who have lived experience and are working full-time in this field and have helped tons and tons of survivors saying, actually, that's not quite right. And then you have someone with no experience and no professional expertise with a whole day of internet research on unverified sites telling you that you don't know your own life. It's just silencing survivors all over again. Some other dangerous narratives: we stay away from the term sex work for describing prostitution. Gets into this whole idea that that's an exercise in personal autonomy where freely consenting adults exchange sex for money. It ignores the harms of the industries. It really legitimizes the consumers, those sex buyers I've told you about. It legitimizes the managers or the traffickers that we've been talking about. There's a lot of advocacy right now for decriminalization of the buying and selling of sex. It avoids regulating the industry. I can tell you and give you so many resources on why this is so dangerous. We advocate for the equality model or partial decrim, meaning that person in prostitution being sold for sex should never, ever be criminalized. But we need to hold, again, that triangle that I showed you, the traffickers, the buyers, and those third-party facilitators accountable. Make sure that there are protections from the vulnerable. So here's the equality model. It has 4 key principles. We need to decriminalize the people in prostitution. We need to focus any investigations and prosecutions on those that drive the market, the sex buyers, the facilitators. Law enforcement has to commit to treating buying sex as a serious crime of interpersonal violence. We need to have a robust public education campaign about the inherent harms of prostitution. We want to have that pool of people being harmed in prostitution become smaller and smaller. And there needs to be a funded, robust, holistic social services that include exit strategies so people can leave the life if they choose to. So we know that the equality model reduces demand, reduces sex trafficking, absolutely makes available support services for survivors, and the societal attitudes start to change and shift on that paradigm so that we're seeing that prostitution and sex trafficking really is about gender-based inequality. And full decriminalization and legalization has the opposite effect. So that's all I have for you today. Did I answer all the questions? I know we started late, so I'm trying to end right on time when we started. Isn't the dissemination of all false information online contributing to this? Absolutely, absolutely 100%. And that's why we need to be careful. You know, I have a lot of students, undergrad, who ask questions, as well as our law students and people. We've been giving this myth busting, a longer seminar on myth busting nationally since July. It's really important, and I'm just going to give you one example and then I'll stop talking. Over the summer, the U.S. Marshals were working alongside of NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, on finding and locating missing children who were reported to NCMEC. And it started running wild on social media that 39 victims of sex trafficking were recovered in Georgia or rescued in Georgia in the back of a double-wide tractor trailer. I'm sorry, why isn't that on the front page of the Chicago Tribune and the Kansas City Star and the New York Times and the Washington Post and on every single media outlet on the television? It wasn't there. Go to a news source that you trust and then go to another news source that you trust. So we were looking in like the media in Georgia and the Atlanta area. Yes, 39 children were recovered by the U.S. Marshals. They found them. 3 of them had been trafficked. The rest of them were just missing, divorce type of like child missing situations. But 39 children were not recovered in the back of a big truck. So it's really important to use our critical thinking skills and go to media sources that we trust and go to more than one. It's super important. I'm happy to stay on for a little bit and answer anyone else's questions. I'm so grateful for all of you for coming today, for making your contributions to our fellowship, for helping us to continue to provide these amazing services that we provide for survivors of sex trafficking. It's so critical and it's so important, and for helping us keep these resources in play so that we can do this. Please email me, shea.rhodes@law.villanova.edu. Check us out on social media. Lax, have I missed anything? Did I get it all?
I think you got it all. I'm gonna share the chance to sign up for our newsletter in the chat right now. We only send one a month, so we're not gonna spam you, I promise.
Thank you all so much. Please stay in touch with us, and we hope to see you next week. And you'll learn more from us. And just thank you so much for being part and being here with us today and helping us get this messaging out during Human Trafficking Awareness Month. Everybody have an awesome day.